A very good morning to you. Thanks so much for talking to us, Jonathan Reynolds.
Good morning.
Let's start with the issue of asylum, because the focus this week has very much been on asylum seekers. It's been the issue of the week, hasn't it? What would Labour do? What specifically would you do to reduce the number of people who are coming here by unsafe means?
Good morning. Yes, it certainly has been the story of the week. I mean, the entire approach from government, to me, lacks any sense of basic competence or compassion. Look, there's no easy way to address a crisis like this, but fundamentally what we would do is process that backlog of claims. I think we have the worst of all worlds at the minute, where people who should be qualifying for refuge in this country have to wait too long for it in conditions which are unacceptable, and people who shouldn't be in this country aren't processed quickly enough and then told to leave the country. And crucially, rather than have gimmicks, expensive gimmicks like the Rwanda plan, which clearly hasn't deterred anyone from trying to come to the UK, we would spend that money on the National Crime Agency, on a specific cell designed to stop the people smuggling who are clearly involved in this trade. But that's the only way to tackle this, is competence, tackling the claims that come in a way which, frankly, the country did in the past and no longer does, and focusing our policing and law and order resources on the criminal gangs who are involved in it.
What about opening up new kinds of routes into the country that are safer, that perhaps would deter people from taking trips in small boats across the Channel? Open up more safer legal routes?
Well, I think you obviously must have safer and legal routes to come to the UK, and particularly when they respond to particular conflicts around the world that have led to refugee flows coming through that. But I'll be frank, I don't think any of that would address the problem if we have over 100,000 people currently waiting for their claims to be processed, as is the case today. I mean, that's up from 40,000 5 years ago. I understand just 4% of the claims relating to people who came to the country last year have been processed. I mean, how can a system operate in that kind of environment? And I just don't feel the government is interested in addressing their own clearly basic failures in this area, and that's why you have this never-ending set of gimmicks of frankly things which won't make a difference, because they're trying to deflect from the fact they've been, unfortunately, completely incompetent on this.
You talk about people being held in unacceptable conditions. Talking to the policing minister earlier, he said that a number of people have been moved out of Manston, for example, and into hotels. Do you have asylum seekers in your constituency, in hotels there?
Yes, I mean, people will be aware, an area like mine, I represent Tameside on the east side of Manchester. How the system works is that actually areas of the country where accommodation is cheaper tend, by this government, to take the burden of that. Now, I've checked the figures for my local area this week. It's actually less than I thought it would be, but this is a reality for people, and fundamentally comes down to the fact that the government doesn't address the basic cause of this in the way that it should, and that's the frustration that people have with how the system works.
So you say that you've got the figures of the people in your constituency. Are you happy to have more migrants move to your constituency? Are your constituents happy about having people there and moved away from Kent and away from processing centres like Manston?
Well, people all around this country, and my constituents are no different, understand the national nature of this problem and are willing to play their part in it. I will be frank, there is at times resentment at the fact that some parts of the country are asked to take a bigger share of the burden of this, and the government tends not to fund that in the way that I think is required. But at the cause of this, what people want, they want the country to be a bastion of compassion to people who are genuinely seeking refuge and need to be in this country for that reason, and they're very happy to support that. And actually, local organisations, local civic society, particularly churches and faith communities, play a massive role within that. But what they expect from government is some competence, is that they're going to process these claims, they're going to make sure people are given the compassion they deserve, or if they're not eligible to be in the country, processed accordingly, and then leave the country. And that is what we haven't got at the minute. And it is getting worse year on year. The longer the Conservatives are in power, the worse this problem gets.
Well, yes, and Kent county councillors have put forward complaints about saying that county is taking an unnecessary level of burden in terms of dealing with extra people. Would you say you were happy to offer up your hotels in your constituency as places that they should travel to?
Look, a constituency like mine, frankly, doesn't have a significant number of hotels, so it's not a practical offer or ability to do it in that way. I can understand how local representatives in a place like Kent feel they have to take a considerable burden of this. The geography of the country is part of that. But again, what they need is an approach from government which is competent, which is compassionate, which addresses the root cause of this, which isn't about gimmicks or grandstanding or Home Secretaries who frankly shouldn't be restored to government trying to grandstand for their own political ambitions. This country will, and many countries in Europe have had this situation, this issue to deal with for some time, but it hasn't, in the last few years in particular, been dealt with in the way it should be done. And that is at the cause of resentment. I think if the government had some basic competence on this, you wouldn't see the resentments and the pressures which we currently see all around the country.
I want to turn attention to the economy now, if I can. Reports out this morning that Sizewell C, the nuclear plant for Suffolk that's being planned, is now under review as the government tries to cut spending. Chris Philp couldn't confirm whether or not that was true. These are reports at this stage. But what do you make of that?
Well, we support a new nuclear power station at that site. What really frustrates me at the minute is I think you're seeing the government flying kites every day, some expectation management around the autumn statement. The reality is they've crashed the economy and they've got to then take corrective action because of it. But what would really frustrate me is to see cuts in the kind of investments which actually are crucial to the long-term prosperity of the country. I mean, the one thing I'll say Liz Truss was right on was that it's not just the last month that's been a problem for the British economy, it's the last 12 years. I mean, the economy hasn't grown as it should have done. And what you see with the government flying these kites every day in the media before they give us some firm information is something which further undermines confidence in the UK. I mean, despite all the brilliant things we have going for us in this country, the UK is the country with the lowest level of business investment in the G7, and political instability leading to economic instability has been a major cause of that. And for me, the Conservatives will never be the answer to that, because unfortunately they are directly responsible for it.
Sizewell, for example, has a £20 billion price tag, roughly. Labour obviously would be keen to back that still going ahead. Also making commitments on tax, for example, saying that you're committed to the triple log. Are you in a position now where you're committing to higher spending at a time when the Chancellor certainly says that we can't afford it?
Well, first of all, we're going to make a distinction between long-term investment spending in the UK and day-to-day revenue spending. Now, for us on day-to-day spending, we would not spend a penny more than we raise in taxation. We don't believe in the Conservative approach that you can borrow money to pay for unfunded tax cuts for the well-off. And clearly, one of the reasons we're in such a situation is where they've got to. So where we would, for instance, have an expanded NHS workforce, improve the backlogs in the NHS, that money would come from abolishing the non-dom rule, that bring in about £3.2 billion. We would tax the income from private equity money differently. We would not have charitable status for private schools. So every time we present a spending commitment on day-to-day spending, we'll always say where that money came from. And that's why we can put them forward those policies. But particularly on borrowing money, we believe you can borrow money to address a crisis. You can borrow money to invest in the long-term investments the country needs, but you can't borrow money for day-to-day spending.